All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a massive collision of expectations and reality. We're going to contrast the grand, sweeping expectations of early Spanish explorers with these startling and honestly often brutal realities they actually faced the moment they pushed into North America.
So picture this. The Spanish are marching north, and they have a very specific vision in mind. They were fully expecting to just roll in and plunder vast, rich native empires, exactly like they'd done down in Central and South America. They were chasing the same immense wealth they'd found in places like Tenochtitlan.
But what actually happens when would-be conquerors run headfirst into swamps and poisoned arrows instead of endless gold? The culture shock was immediate. Take Juan Ponce de Leon back in 1513. He lands in Florida dreaming of untold riches, but that fantasy violently clashed with reality when his expedition was abruptly stopped by a poisoned arrow from the Calusa peoples.
Which brings us to Chapter 1, Chasing North American Riches, the Florida Disasters.
These early, super confident expeditions, they turned into total catastrophes almost overnight. The Spanish completely underestimated the complex, organized indigenous resistance waiting for them. A stark example of this arrogant miscalculation happened with the Tocobaga people. The Tocobaga had actually respectfully wrapped deceased Europeans from a previous shipwreck in these valuable painted skins. But Fray Juan Suarez, the bishop who came along, just assumed it was, quote, devilish idolatry and disastrously burned the crates and the bodies. That single, arrogant act on sacred ground instantly ruined relations and got the explorers expelled. And when the Spanish finally did stumble upon the much-talked-about Apalachee chiefdom, they definitely didn't find a pliant empire waiting to be subjugated. Instead, they faced an incredibly organized, militant resistance from a highly complex society of up to 34,000 people. To put that in perspective, they had extensive agriculture and massive long-distance trade routes. When the Spanish tried to take hostages, the Apalachee fought back fiercely. Their captured chief expertly tricked the explorers, literally leading them away from the capital, deep into swamps and enemy lines, just to get rid of them.
That takes us to Chapter 2, an epic odyssey of survival, Cabeza de Vaca's transformation. Now, the timeline of his journey is just wild. It's the story of an expedition that shipwrecked off the coast of Texas, instantly reducing proud conquerors to desperate castaways. Alvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca underwent an unbelievable 6-year transformation just to survive. He completely flipped the script. Starting with that shipwreck in 1528, he and his men were taken in by the Karankawa, but they quickly overstayed their welcome. Cabeza de Vaca went from a would-be Spanish master to essentially an enslaved laborer doing harsh, trivial work. By 1534, he finally escapes, becomes a neutral trader, and then by 1535, he actually refashions himself as a highly respected native medicine man. To survive that grueling ordeal, he had to completely adapt to indigenous life. I mean, the guy learned 6 different indigenous languages. He even performed the first recorded surgery in the American Southwest. An Avavares man was struck by an arrowhead, and Cabeza de Vaca actually cut open the wound, extracted the weapon, and stitched it closed. This successful feat earned him a massive reputation. He and his companions were suddenly celebrated as holy men, eventually earning the protection of thousands of native followers who willingly guided them safely all the way back to Mexico City. Moving on to Chapter 3, Coronado and Pueblo Resistance, the Southwest Clashes. So, spurred on by Cabeza de Vaca's wild survival tales, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado arrives in 1540 with a massive army. But the sheer absurdity of the Spanish approach here was glaring. Upon arriving at the Zuni town of Jawica, Coronado immediately had the requiremento read aloud. This was a 1513 royal decree demanding that indigenous people accept Spanish rule and Christianity or face enslavement and death. Keep in mind, they read this out loud despite a total language barrier. The Zuni, entirely unimpressed, responded by drawing a sacred line of corn that the Spaniards were not to cross. And when the Spanish ignored that, the Zuni fired arrows to defend their homes. The Pueblo peoples weren't just going to accept this. They actively resisted this violent Spanish occupation to protect their deep, complex cultures, traditions embodied by sacred figures like the Zuni Kachina. And this resistance wasn't just physical, right? It was deeply strategic. Later on, a native guide known to the Spanish as the Turk intentionally and strategically misled Coronado's entire army out into the vast, endless grasslands of Kansas. His real mission? To get the Spaniards so hopelessly lost they could never return to terrorize the Pueblo villages. It was just a brilliant act of defensive sabotage. Let's jump to Chapter 4, Exploring the Pacific Coast, Myths of Gold and Amazons.
Meanwhile, as Coronado is getting hopelessly lost in Kansas, the Spanish imagination over on the Pacific coast is just completely off the rails, totally disconnected from reality. They were literally expecting to find a terrestrial paradise. Their writers were spinning these tales of an island called California, supposedly populated entirely by black Amazonian women wielding golden weapons without a single man among them. But the indigenous reality? Entirely different. Instead of gold-clad warrior women, the Spanish encountered thriving, complex societies of fishermen, farmers, and hunters who met these strange invaders with well-deserved fear and hostile resistance. Resistance the Spanish could barely hold off, even with gifts.
Because the actual wealth of California wasn't literal mountains of gold. It was its incredibly diverse indigenous cultures. Coastal native groups like the Chumash were out there expertly navigating the seas in these impressive, traditionally built driftwood canoes known as tomals. When explorers like Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo arrived in 1542, they were entering a fully realized complex world. It wasn't just some blank canvas for Spanish fantasy.
Which brings us to Chapter 5, Missions and Cultural Clashes, from Conquest to Pacification. Burdened by the massive financial costs of all those failed military invasions we just talked about, Spain dramatically shifted its strategy. The rhetoric shifted away from explicit military conquest toward religious pacification. Franciscans and Jesuits stepped up to the forefront, embedding themselves in indigenous communities and establishing this vast network of 21 missions across Alta California. But make no mistake here, this wasn't just about sharing a faith. It was strategically designed to fundamentally restructure native life, forcing them into European-style agriculture and actively suppressing their traditional languages and their leaders.
And you really just have to hear this chilling quote from Juan de Oñate to understand the brutal reality hiding beneath that religious veneer. He wrote, "The greatest force we possess is the prestige of the Spanish nation, by fear of which the Indians have been kept in check." Colonizers like Oñate relied heavily on theatrical violence and systemic terror. When the Acoma village resisted his invasion, his troops massacred hundreds, and he literally ordered 1 foot cut off of every surviving male over 15. It was an administration of pure terror.
Now, beyond the sheer physical violence, the cultural collision here was especially intense regarding gender and sexuality. The Pueblo View world saw women as empowered by their control of agriculture, and they viewed sexuality as natural fertility and regeneration. The Franciscans, on the other hand, viewed this power as emasculating to men. They believed sexuality had to be strictly controlled, shamed, and punished. So missionaries fiercely tried to strip away the traditional authority of Pueblo women, going so far as to use physical punishment, lashes, and forcing men and women into separate living quarters. It was a systematic attempt to dismantle the very core of Pueblo society.
Take the San Miguel Chapel in Santa Fe, for example, built in 1610 with these massive adobe walls. By the time this isolated settlement was established, the Franciscan friars actually thought they had full control. But the reality on the ground was entirely different. The Pueblo people adopted a brilliant survival strategy. They publicly complied with the Newtown governments and building projects, all while secretly preserving their ancient traditions right beneath the noses of the friars. They seamlessly combined the new with the old, ensuring their culture survived.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. By attempting to erase deeply rooted cultures through strict reform, theatrical violence, and fear, did the Spanish simply guarantee centuries of seething discontent? When myths of easy conquest crash into fierce, organized native resilience, who truly shapes the history of a continent? It's a powerful question to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history you think you know.